Hello and welcome to Power, People and Planet. My name is Kumi and this is a series of candid conversations with community workers, activists, artists and others who are trying to address some of the most important global challenges that humanity faces. In this episode, we are taking a bit more of a focused look on what is happening in South Africa. In 2024, sometime between March and August, South Africa will have a very important election where much is at stake. And I'm pleased to say that we have one of South Africa's most respected intellectuals and activists, Vishwas Satgar, to be in conversation with us to kick off this special series. Vishwas is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Witwatersrand. Many people, even internationally, know he's at Wits University. His academic focus is on the global crises, and he serves as a principal investigator for the Emancipatory Futures Studies in the Anthropocene project. That's a bit of a mouthful, but he will tell us about it. He's a veteran activist, as I said, who cut his teeth in national liberation politics in South Africa. And importantly, he's the co-founder of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, as well as the newly formed Climate Justice Charter movement, where he is a very visible voice and leader. In addition, he edits the book series on democratic Marxism that has brought out, I'm told, 7 episodes so far. Vishwas, thank you so much for joining us on Power, People and Planet, and welcome. And I'm looking very much forward to this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Kumi, and I'm looking forward to engaging.
Okay, great. So without any further, tell us about Vishwas Satgar. Take a couple of minutes to tell us your journey in life. I have the privilege of knowing a little bit about it. I'm sure you're going to tell me some things that I don't know.
Well, I mean, listen, child of national liberation, like you, and very much kind of caught up in the tides of mass politics of the 1980s, shaped by that, formed by that. My political home was the Natal Indian Congress in Pietermaritzburg, the UDF, and kind of grew into the 90s and kind of thought very deeply about existentially where I should be. A country that was leaving behind, decades and centuries of colonialism and apartheid. And we were on the brink of a great transformation. And so I decided that I would spend a lot of time in the country and working for the labor movement, which is what I did. I trained in law. I chose not to practice law. I got a master's in labor law.
That we have something in common.
And so I ended up working for COSATU's think tank, Naledi. And I worked on labor market reform for 5 years. It was quite an exciting space to be in. And we were kind of dismantling the old racialized and gendered labor market system in the country and putting in place and going against the sort of neoliberalization in the world, a new labor market regime, affecting millions of workers and people in the country.
I'm just going to pause you there to just say, for those of our viewers and listeners who might not, neoliberalism is not necessarily a comfortable word.
Sure.
Can you just, because it's such an important part of our reality right now, can you just take a minute to just unpack what neoliberalism is?
Sure. So neoliberalism is a set of ideas that has been used to organize societies for the past 4 decades. And these ideas center around the primacy of markets as the basis to organize society, the power of corporations, particularly big banks and finance houses, and giving them a central place in shaping not just economies, but how we live. And of course, trying to reshape the state so that the state is actually withdrawn from its provisioning role, from its support role for society. So in the end, neoliberalism is all about, in the context of global sort of geopolitics, about us all becoming like Americans, basically.
And how is that?
Basically, a society that's highly indebted, a society that's precarious, a society that is
highly
unequal, a country that has one of the largest per capita carbon emission footprints in the world, and so on.
And has one of the largest prison populations in the world.
And it incarcerates the social problem. Yeah.
So it's great for people to know your background. So
Yeah.
now I think we want to get right into it, right?
Okay.
So when I'm speaking at international conferences and so on, when people tell me to describe the state of the world, I always say there's a very good Afrikaans sentence that actually,
Yeah.
even if you don't know Afrikaans, you'll know it when I say it. Where I say the state of the world is deep, deep, deep in the kak, right? So I think having been at home since October 2020 and getting re-involved at the grassroots level in South Africa and so on, I think ONS is deep, deep, deep in the kak. So give us your sense of how did we get from the promise of building a different kind of society with such a high level of civil society engagement. How did we get from that point to this point? If you can give us a 30-year overview in 3 minutes, 5 minutes, that'll be great. What went wrong?
Yeah. So I mean, let's unpack the cuck a little bit, right? So you're actually dealing with a society that is not being held together by the state. It's not being held together by capital. And it's a society that's really unraveling. I mean, everyday headline news, institutions biting the dust, whether it's a local government, it's a department, scandalous stuff, shameful stuff around corruption. And then, of course, all the big indicators, top of the charts in terms of structural unemployment in the world, top of the charts in terms of inequality.
One of the highest suicide rates in the world. We are only second to Russia.
Exactly. And, obesity levels in an African context off the charts, et cetera, and hunger, a very serious problem. So, yes, it's a society in a very profound and a deep crisis. It's what I would call a crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. It's a society that's gridlocked. It cannot reproduce itself. People cannot survive in the society. We are moving increasingly from an unlivable to unviable society. So how do we explain this? In a nutshell, I would argue there's two things that we need to consider. The one is the crisis of the National Liberation Project. And this largely has to do with the political choices that were made. And you and I know the ANC-led alliance, something that we all sort of grew up in some way and contributed to in some way, had deep and profound legitimacy in this country. And it basically had everything on the plate. It came to power, you had the Mandela factor, we steered clear of the kind of huge kind of conflict moments, etc. Great leap forward for the society. But there were choices made. And this comes back to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as a class project. And the fact that in the end, African nationalism in the ANC form anyway, chose not transformation. Because if you look at the history of national liberation politics, at the heart of non-racialism, at the heart of the Freedom Charter, was an understanding that capitalism was implicated in racial and gender oppression. That was abandoned. And instead, a choice was made for deracializing capitalism, using globalization, opening up the society, dropping tariffs. I mean, workers just lost their jobs left, right, and center, and so on and so on. So there was a naive embrace of deep globalization of the South African economy. It was externalized in very, very problematic ways. Now, of course, the ANC would argue, well, we put social grants in place, etc. I mean, hey, you look at the cost of an average basket of food for a woman-headed household today, it's over 4,980. A social grant is in the 2,000 rand range, okay? So there's clearly a crisis there of social reproduction. But anyway, these choices were made. And yes, we have about 5 to 6 million new African middle class. We know about the big billionaires, including our president and so on. But that's definitely not a transformed society. And in the making of this class project, of a project for a minority, there's been major de-radicalization that's happened, demobilization that has happened. There's been an embrace of a false normalcy. Okay, we're building a post-apartheid democracy and, well, get rid of radicalism and so on. I mean, even the left inside the alliance was dealt with in particular ways. COSATU was...
So when you say the left within the alliance, can you just...
COSATU, the Communist Party, I mean, they were divided...
And the ANC were...
And some elements in the ANC, absolutely. And so they were neutralized in particular ways, co-opted, divided, weakened, and so on and so on. And even, intellectually and politically isolated. And lambasted, etc.
And you yourself... when do you disassociate with the ANC, Communist Party, COSATU alliance?
It's in the midst of all of this, but I'll come to it. I mean,
Sure.
so just to say that the National Liberation Project has basically sown the seeds of this crisis in the choices that it made. The second explanation I'll put forward for why we're in this crisis, it's related to the choices, but it's also unleashed a set of crisis tendencies. So on the one hand, we haven't constitutionalized a constitutional democracy since 94. We have elements of it, but we actually have a market democracy. So, credit rating agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, they have more power over us as voting citizens in terms of economic policy choices.
Correct. And that would be the case for almost everybody in the global south, for sure.
Exactly, that have been structurally adjusted to global capital. I mean, the second, and so that what that means is that you have a very fragile democracy, a market democracy, that can actually, in the current context, actually expire. It can basically unravel completely, okay? Because democracy has been delegitimized in this process, at least this form of democracy. I think the second systemic crisis that has emerged in the midst of all of this has got to do with the high kind of financialized inequality unemployment. I mean, the policy choices that have been made have given us a society in which you have low wage earning. So most workers in this country earn below even the upper bounded poverty line. They cannot survive. So there's been a concentration of wealth at the top. And so, again, exclusion in a very, very serious way alongside high unemployment. I mean, many countries in the world would not have been able to maintain any semblance of stability given the high levels of unemployment in this country. I think the third important sort of underlying systemic crisis tendency here is the nature of what I would call food politics. And basically in South Africa, we are not feeding our population. We have an uncaring society. And yet you'd have Agri-SA, for example, declare that they produce enough food to feed this country, okay? Most of our produce is exported, from ocean products to fruit, etc. And a lot of the kind of the grain that's produced is used as livestock feed while people are starving. So you have these sharp paradoxes and problems around this. And then finally, I would just say that we have an economy that is steeped in resource extractivism. And it's got a history, as you know. But the new waves of extractivism that we've seen have been linked to transactional politics. And this is where a kind of nexus of the ruling party, the state,
and
big business, chiefs, etc., have a lot to answer for. There's massive dispossession going on of even customary land in this country. There's a lot of pollution going on. There's numerous flashpoints around the dispossessions that are coming with all of this. So essentially, we have a two-level crisis, if I were to explain it. We have a crisis of the National Liberation Project and the choices it's made and the forces it's unleashed. And we have a systemic crisis, all adding up to a total crisis.
So, given that very optimistic picture, let me take you back a bit, right? And or let me bring you into the present and just ask you what should be the response of South African citizens who feel that things have reached a point now where you cannot expect solutions to come from the state, that you have to actually push government into action almost from below. And I just wanted to just give a quick sense of South African politics, especially for those that might not be that familiar. So let's start with the ANC. I'm going to play a 30-minute game with you, a 30-second game, right? I say the name of the party, you give me a 30-second reaction. ANC in 30 seconds, where are they today?
A criminalized national liberation movement.
Okay. Parasitic oligarchy.
Parasitic, self-seeking, self-preserving, and shameful and actually uncaring.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that the ANC that we confront today, that the citizens will confront at the ballot box, bears no resemblance to the ANC that you and I were part of decades ago?
Absolutely.
Okay.
A pariah.
Democratic Alliance.
untransformed elite interests, kind of very narrow in how it understands transformation in this country, and as a result has a profound disconnect with what needs to be done.
EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters.
Exclusionary nationalist, populist, deeply contradictory, anti-democratic, dangerous.
Okay, so when you say deeply contradictory, is it the question of symbolically wearing red overalls to associate with worker while wearing Gucci shoes and Rolex watches underneath those red overalls?
Correct, and on the one hand, defending the Palestinian peoples, and on the other hand, targeting foreigners in the South African economy. It's another example of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, Inkatha Freedom Party.
Traditionalist, kind of lacking any conception of how modern governance should work, capitalizing on the kind of weaknesses of the ANC in the context of traditional Zulu society, not capable of advancing a project that's inclusive for all of South Africa.
Okay. Now, there's, of course, other parties. I want to pick up one because, in a way, it's the first breakaway from the ANC, and it was actually driven by concerns around corruption that goes to the Wild Coast and Saul Kersner giving money for the first elections of the ANC and so on, and that is Bantu Limisa and the United Democratic Movement. What's your sense of them?
I mean, listen, they have found a voice and a place in institutional politics. But again, I mean, the kind of political opposition we have in South Africa, and they're emblematic of it, is that they are noisemakers. And of course, they will attempt to place before society maybe an issue of corruption if they're triggered by somebody or something. But again, they are not articulating a way forward for the country.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't see them as, if you like, forces that can take us beyond the crises that we're living.
And perhaps another breakaway from the ANC, COPE.
Well, again, I mean, COPE...
Congress of the People, as they call it,
yeah. I mean, COPE kind of tried to style itself on, like, the real Congress tradition, right? Congress of the People, harking back to 55. It was still stuck in the national liberation imaginary in more ways than one. And again, it was a reactive response to factional politics inside the ANC. And it was incapable of presenting a project for where the country should go. And so it ended up capitalizing on fallout inside the ANC, very much like the EFF, and having some kind of parliamentary presence, but again, not providing decisive leadership for the society.
Now, let me ask you a difficult question, right? What if I said, maybe we all should have expected this, right? And then pose the difficult question, globally speaking, beyond the African continent. Can we find good examples of a liberation movement, right? When they secured power, they might have excelled as a liberation movement. I'm not saying the ANC necessarily excelled as a liberation movement, but let's say that we accept that there was lots of heroism, courage, sacrifice, and so on. We were part of it. Many millions were, right? But where in the world is there an example where the liberation movement, when securing power, excelled in exercising power? It's a difficult question, but I would like to push you to see where are the examples we can look at.
So, I mean, in the African context, we have to bring some nuance to this question. I mean, we had anti-colonial movements, particularly in Southern Africa, and they were complicated in their transitions beyond colonialism, particularly by imperialism. So if you look at both Angola and Mozambique as examples, I mean, the protagonist forces there were inspired by a Marxism-Leninism. They were serious political forces. But of course, they came up against the apartheid regime and destabilization. They came up against a global geopolitical alliance with Washington. And Southern Africa became a very serious battleground during the Cold War. So it's very, very hard to, in that context, reach like firm conclusions around these movements. But post, if you like, colonialism, what's very striking in their records is that they have not been transformative. Okay, they have found an institutional grip on power, and they have entrenched themselves, and they have not matured their democracies. They have not ensured that this profound transformation based on historical commitments and aspirations. If you look at the Indian context, for example, the Indian Congress, again, an anti-colonial movement, very powerful in the first half of the 20th century. Within 10 years, it was criminalized as the political force. I mean, it had a project to sort of modernize India, and sort of Nehruvian socialism was that imaginary, and they attempted to kind of take that society in a particular direction, industrialize it, kind of attempt some land reform. But again, a lot of it was stuck. A lot of it got complicated by, if you like, very powerful interests, and these movements lost the nerve to lead transformation. So we're not sitting with a historical record that is very, very inspiring. And so, in a sense, I think our conversation in South Africa has to be about a post-national liberation politics.
Okay, now that's exactly where I want to go. So what I want to do is just quickly ask you to say where we are and what options citizens thinking about people getting, not just how they're going to vote, but about how they get involved between now and the elections. Where do you see South Africa? And then after that, I want to go into the work that you're doing on the Climate Justice Charter campaign.
So I think, we have this set of crises that are converging, and it has to be kept front and center in how we're thinking about how we do politics. It's got to anchor how we're thinking way forward, how we're thinking future, how we're thinking the next South Africa. If we're not doing that, then I think we end up very narrowly thinking the political as something that is very simple. You either form a party or you vote for a party, and that's going to solve South Africa's problems. I think that's misplaced. If you're keeping the crisis front and center, then we have to really think about a new politics, a thoroughly transformative politics. And that means a politics that's capable of helping us grasp, that national liberation politics is over. And so a cogent and a compelling critique and analysis of that. We have to have an understanding of where we are as a country in the context of global capitalism today, and how that's impacted us, and the choices we need to make. And then thirdly, we need to understand that we need to bring people into democratic politics for deep transformation to happen, for us to secure a future, a livable, just, and democratic future. And so if we work with those ideas, and we start trying to figure out, what do we do, then I think we are talking about a politics that is really going to the heart of the issues. Because without going to the heart of the issues, again, we're going to misrecognize where we are as a country. We're going to misrecognize the problems, and we're going to prefer solutions that actually don't take us very far. Interestingly enough, we are in a context that requires us to, once upon a time would have been considered, outlandish, too radical, kind of marginal thinking. Mm-hmm. But to really secure South Africa's future, we have to have an imaginary that is bold, that is courageous, that has to confront this total crisis. And that means putting forward some very, very transformative solutions. And that's where the battle lines have to be drawn. I mean, whether we're talking about, food issues, whether we're talking about the unemployment crisis, whether we're talking about the climate crisis, we cannot, as a country, continue with a political discourse that is populist, that is performative, that is not providing answers to these problems. And so that's my response to that.
Okay, I'll try and bring you back to that right then, because I'm going to give you a heads up now. I'm going to ask you to predict what's going to happen after the election, right? What will the balance of forces look like? But let's go to the work that you're doing, right? One of the most promising things we've seen emerge in the last 2 years has been the Climate Justice Charter campaign. Can you just describe what the campaign is and what the charter is?
So the Climate Justice Charter emerged out of the campaigning of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and COPAC during the worst drought.
COPAC is?
The Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. During the worst drought in the history of this country, actually. And we made the connection between high food prices, drought, corporate controlled food system, and climate. And that was a very, very important entry point. In 2018, we called on the president publicly with 65 other organizations to convene an emergency sitting of parliament to speak to the 1.5 degrees Celsius report of the UN. They ignored us. And so in that context, and recognizing that day zero was a reality in many, many parts of the country, not just Cape Town, and working with those communities, we started a process of dialogue. And we spoke to climate justice and social justice organizations, environmental justice organizations, faith organizations, labor organizations, and crystallized out what they understand as climate justice. What is a just transition? What are the principles that should guide this, etc. And we produced the world's first climate justice charter. It's very comprehensive as a document. And we worked very closely with climate scientists, the leading climate scientists in the country, and they helped us, and we encouraged them to translate the climate science for South Africa. And they came up with 2 or 3 very important points. One, we're one of 10 hotspots. 2, we're heating at twice the global average. So when the world overshoots 1.5, we're going to be at 3 within the next decade. And we are a country now prone to extremes, climate extremes, including serious risks for our food systems and so on. So that, together with community demands to end hunger, pollution, and climate harm, we took to Parliament in 2020. Section 234 of the South African Constitution provides for charters to be adopted. And we went as citizens to claim that right. Parliament did not respond to us. 2021, we took a fire brigade to the gates of Parliament, led by young people, etc. And the most they could tell us is that there's no procedure in Parliament to adopt this. So, long and short of it, the Climate Justice Charter is a plurivision. It seeks to address the legacies of apartheid, the current poly crisis, and secure this livable, just, and democratic future. The second thing about the Charter is that it is a compass for transformative action. So the principles in the Charter, the 14 systemic alternatives in the Charter, are a guide to what we do in communities, what we do in workplaces, what we do in sectors, what we do in the state. The third thing about the Charter is that it is a call for a climate justice deal for South Africa, a climate emergency social contract, if you like. And that's very, very important given the crisis that we are in. The last thing about the Charter is that it is evoking the need for us to build a whole new kind of movement-driven politics, a transformative politics. And we are now in a new phase of trying to capacitate and build that movement from below.
So let me ask the difficult question here. What percentage of South African people right now know about the Charter and you would say support it?
So 275 organizations have endorsed the Charter, and that's growing. As I said, our roots are in the drought. And so many, many people
Most trees, their roots are not in the drought. They die in the drought, but your roots are in the drought. Great.
No, but the point I want to make is that, in 2011, I took 120 of my students down to COP17, I think it was, in Durban.
Yeah.
It was harder to make the arguments then about climate because that 1.5 degrees shift hadn't happened in 2015. In the midst of the droughts, people were making the connection. So there is a high level of awareness in South African society that there is a living climate crisis. We've also had the rain bomb in Durban, which killed almost 500 people, devastation, as you know. We've had...
So just for those who don't know, this was in April of 2022. This was in my home city, Durban. My town, the township I grew up in, was devastated. The local
Yeah.
temple was completely washed away, but
Yeah.
close to 500 people died. We don't know for sure the number.
Yeah.
And people are still living in temporary accommodation
Exactly.
2 years later.
So the point being that climate extremes are a lived reality, and we are emerging in that context. We are connecting those realities to the struggle for a climate justice future.
So why I ask that question as pointedly as that, because I feel what is needed for us to win justice, economic justice, social justice in South Africa and globally is not necessarily new visionary ideas. I think there's lots of ideas in our history. If you just go back and look at what we were saying before the first democratic election, if we just did that, we would be in a completely different space, right?
Yeah.
The real challenge is whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in the United States, where we see fascism on the rise and democracy in decline, we face a very big challenge, which I think was probably most well put by Louis Althusser in the 70s, when he said, and I can paraphrase, that the mistake some of us make is we think that governments control us and corporations control us mainly through the deployment of the repressive state apparatus, army, police, formal laws, and so on. And while he and others would concede that, of course, the repressive state apparatus, all of those things determines the space for political life and so on. But the argument would be that actually the more insidious and more powerful form of control is the ideological state apparatus, by which we mean the framework for education, the framework for religion, the funding of arts and culture, and most importantly, the framework for communications and media. So what I feel, having been around a little bit, is that I hear great visionary ideas all the time. But one of the challenges that we face is how do we communicate to a large enough audience of people who need to be active participants in the struggle, not spectators.
Sure.
How do we break that communications deficit that we have?
So, Kumi, there's a couple of things we're doing. I mean, the one is we challenged the media head on as we were developing the charter. We occupied the offices of SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum, the Press Ombuds, the Sunday Times, but with the intent of trying to get them to meet the challenge of mainstreaming the climate crisis. And, you know, since we did that work in 2019 and they came on board to even shape the charter, there's been increasing media coverage around the climate crisis. And that's now talking to society. It's not where we want it to be, where there's like a consistent focus on like the climate crisis and it's part of, you know, news reporting and formats, etc. But it's there. The second thing that we're busy doing is figuring out how we accelerate the just transition in communities and workplaces. And now we've got over 20 years of activism around this, where, you know, we've done work around cooperatives, solidarity economy, food sovereignty. We just did a guide on people's planning. Today, we've been invited to Parliament to make a submission on the climate bill. And we are saying this climate bill has to be people and worker driven. It has to come soon rather than later, like within the next 3 months. It has to take planning beyond what we've had, whether it's NEDLAC, the National Economic Development Labour Council, whether it's the National Development Plan, to involve all state institutions, horizontal and vertical, but driven from below. We are also doing a third thing, which is we are developing the charter into policies. And maybe this is where I think that it's important to keep in mind that ideas still matter and debates still matter and thinking still matters today, given the crisis where we are in. Okay, so we're trying to figure out the nuts and bolts. I mean, how do you meet the energy needs of South Africa? So we're busy developing a policy on socially owned and community renewable energy for the country. What would that energy system look like? So we talk about a renewable energy mix rather than the current mix. And we're talking about what? Solar, concentrated solar, microscale solar. We're talking about wind on and offshore. We're talking about tidal. People don't talk about tidal in this country. We've got 2 oceans, and it has amazing energy factor variables and so on. We're talking about Geothermal. There's just been a study done on geothermal.
What is the potential for geothermal in South Africa? What does that study says?
Well, it basically says that we have some of the oldest rocks in the world, and some of them have a heating factor which can be harnessed. And it's in particular areas of the country.
Sure. That's always how it is.
Yeah. And then, of course, we're talking about microscale hydro. All right. So we do have existing dam infrastructure. How do you retrofit them with climate extremes, more water, make that part of the energy mix? Okay. On farms, we can have microscale. In communities, you can have microscale hydro. Anyway, that kind of conversation is what we're bringing to the fore, and I think that's very, very important. We just launched our first policy, the rights of nature and natural climate solutions. 2 or 3 takeaways which I want to share with you. People talk about planting trees. It's become like a fashion. That's going to save, change and whatever, save us from whatever. And it delays change, actually. We are talking about thinking about biomes and ecosystems, and you planting the relevant trees, shrubs, and plants in clusters, okay? We are talking about community biodiversity registers and protocols so that we reclaim the natural commons in this country. Keeping ecosystems robust, including the oceans, by the way, is very, very important for absorbing carbon. The third thing we're calling for in this policy is what we call convivial decolonial conservation. This challenges everything we've had in South Africa around conservation. Conservation is the national park and the wild animals. We're saying, no, this is about being a friend to nature, wherever nature is, celebrating nature, enjoying nature, being part of nature, propagating it, and so on. So this is work that is important in the ideological battle and contestation that has to happen. It all adds up to what we are calling a climate justice project. Because where we are sitting, Kumi, we cannot rise to this challenge anymore just through symbolic activism, just through kind of talking our way through society, and so on. We've got to be able to talk about the big changes that have to happen, and we've got to have substance to those positions. I mean, anyone who claims to be standing for climate justice, you're talking about large-scale transformation of everything.
But let me say we agree on that. Yeah. Where I think there might be a tension of disagreement, right?
Sure.
And that is, we can agree that we need to reduce emissions, we need to decrease inequality as the broad direction of travel. But I want to suggest something that I've been grappling with. That one of the reasons activism has not been able to mobilize the scale of participation we need to push for the changes that we need in the fast enough time scale that we are facing as a result of climate is that activism talks down to people, right? We present ourselves as the holders of absolute truth, that we know everything, and all we're asking people to do is join, right? Not to be part of creating the solution. So there is a new sort of notion in the world that has emerged in the last 5 years, which is this whole notion of a culture of emergence, which is what you say is that, yes, we need those big transformative things that we need to do. I mean, to say to reduce economic inequality seriously means to fundamentally transform the economic system, right? But you don't actually have a group of intellectuals on their own, for example, working out the nuts and bolts of exactly how we do that. That we establish the direction of travel, and then we say what we need is massive co-creation, people participating on a scale that we never, and that there has to be some space for fluidity.
Yeah.
Right? Because, like, say if you and I were doing a plan for South Africa at the end of 2021, right? And we're talking about all the what you call the renewable energy mix, which I fully support, right? If we were doing that and we worked out our plans and so on, come February 2022, everything changes with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? And right now, just that still holds us as hostage at so many different levels, right? So respond to that and tell me whether you can see, because see, I fully support that we need deep intellectual work, right?
Yeah.
But it's how that intellectual work articulates with the broader efforts of society.
Yes.
Like maybe I'll just conclude by saying that there's a book that's just come out called "The Revolution Will Not Be Litigated," right? What that book is saying, I've contributed to it. It's not saying that litigation as a site of struggle is not important.
Yeah.
But it's saying when you use law,
Yeah.
make sure it's aligned with movements and popular participation and other elements, because a victory in the courts on its own
Yeah.
is not going to give you things. So similarly, I'm saying, a victory in terms of constructing. I've read the Climate Justice Charter campaign, the charter, looking at it in comparison to documents I've seen in many parts of the world. I think it is intersectional, it is wholesome, it's comprehensive, and so on. But I always come down to how do we communicate this in a way that excites people, because they feel actually there's still room in it for me to contribute to shape exactly how it's going to be. And that's what I think, if I look at my work, being self-critical here, whether it was at the South African NGO Coalition in the 90s, whether it was Greenpeace and Amnesty, in the 2000s,
Yeah.
overall, you imagined, because you had a membership-based organization and so on, that you had the solution.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that I think this moment calls for intellectual humility as well as activist humility.
Okay.
Yeah.
We don't disagree. I mean, listen, our entry point has been the socio-ecological crisis of reproduction. People can't feed themselves. People don't have water. That's where we've started our activism. And we co-created the charter out of that kind of intervention work, that kind of collaborative work. Translation of the charter into policies, developing tools to accelerate the just transition. Again, everything we're talking about are drafts. So we're putting it out for further engagement, dialogue, debate, etc. We're trying to partner with the media, and we've got some traction to put some of these ideas out. And I mean, even the Beeld has put out stuff on some of these things and so on. A lot of work still to do there. But we want to incite conversation. And so by August 28th, the next anniversary of the Charter, we're hoping that when all these policies are released, which are happening, they're going to be happening increasingly over the next couple of weeks, there'll be more feedback, more input from people, etc., that will shape that. In terms of practice on the ground of figuring out like a workplace, we're having a big assembly with trade unions on May 18th. All of them are coming, COSATU, SAFTU, etc. It's called the Trade Union and Work Assembly, a CJCM dialogue. The unions are going to lead around how they approach the just transition, what are the challenges, and how they see the way forward. We're going to share with them the work we are doing and talk about collaboration and co-creation of policies, etc. We're doing the same with unemployed people's organizations, informal traders. We're doing it with youth. On June 16th, we're having a big assembly of young people under the banner, the next youth struggle is a climate justice struggle, build the CJCM. And again, for them to shape whatever we've done so far, and so on and so on and so on. So our politics is very much in the kind of vein, in the mold you're talking about. But I do think that the challenge of a social tipping point is the crucial thing we have to figure out. Now, climate politics is a majority politics. It's a politics of everybody, okay?
Yes.
And it's because it affects everybody, it's
Absolutely.
a risk to everybody, it's a challenge to everybody. And so how do we break out from where we are into the mainstream? Now, I don't think there's a formula there, right? So we have 4 strategies that we are working on. I mean, the one is to build a climate justice block of vulnerable governments, frontline island states, and so on, people's, workers, and movements, for a just peace, for earth democracy, and a climate justice deal for Africa. The second strategy is to advance a climate emergency state and climate justice deal for the country. And that climate justice deal is not some top-down thing. It gets constructed from below in workplaces and communities and so on, and it adds up to a national framework. The climate emergency state we're talking about, today's submission to Parliament, is again a climate planning process that is totally inclusive and bottom-up and so on. The third strategy we're talking about is deep democracy. So we need to renew our constitutional democratic project. We want to do that. We're committed to that as part of this just transition, to use all the levers of the Constitution and all the mechanisms to really fire up bottom-up action. And then lastly, to build this people and worker-driven movement that is anchored in accelerating that just transition from below, with partners, with communities, with workplaces, etc. So those are the four legs on which we are walking. And, in next year's election, we're having a debate about whether we should be placing this climate justice charter policy platform in that election, together with a slate of 10 to 15 activists, tried and tested, young and old, so that we could bring this conversation, this narrative, into the mainstream of South African society at a critical moment, where all policies, all parties, all committed to democracy are under scrutiny, right? So it's an amazing moment where we can put forward this narrative of the climate emergency. And it's a serious tactic that we're considering. We're hoping that somebody like yourself would even consider actually being on that slate, together with people like Mark Hayward, Dora Marema, Mazibuko Jaha, etc. Because as we agreed in the start of this conversation, it's not holding together. Okay, and those of us who are committed to this democracy, we have to step in front, but not just step in front in some kind of adventurous way. The problems are real and they're serious, and we've got to be able to now talk to alternatives together with society and co-create. Okay, so I think that's something for us that we all have to consider, is kind of coming at this problem on different fronts, being creative about tactics, and of course ensuring as much as possible we center, if you like, the people and the workers of this country.
So I fully agree that we need to be thinking out of the box. There is a constitutional sort of change that's also allowed independent candidates to run. Zaki Ahmad, the inspirational former leader of Treatment Action Campaign, has already announced his candidacy. We know that there's new political formations that are emerging, and you've now exposed another new sort of energy. And I think my own sense is it's good that there's alternatives. But I think if I put my political science training hat on, just in terms of electoral politics and how the ANC dominates the ideological kind of landscape in many ways, what would play very well into the hands of the ANC right now is multiple new formations that kind of, leave the ANC as the majority party, or to allow them to still be in government in a partnership with the EFF. So given all of that, what firstly is your sense on all these new things that are happening in addition to what you said? But before you comment on it, I want to raise a controversial question about the political project for the elections that you were talking about. I like many aspects of it, but one thing that I've seen globally never work, right? And that is to try to mobilize people on either solely an environmental or climate ticket. And I want to suggest to you that one of the most disservices that that Western environmental activism has done to us is insisting for far too long, even when it was much clearer, that environment cannot be a silo and climate is. In fact, to put climate in the environmental silo was a fundamental error, because it's a cross-cutting, it's about our economy, and as you know very well. So don't you think there might be a limitation if you were to go to the South African people on primarily a climate message? Because while I think if you make a comparison between how it was when we were lighties growing up in KZN, I mean, when we were growing up, people who did environmental stuff, our sense was they were white people and rich people, right? Because like when you had food in your stomach, a roof over your head and so on, then you worried about the environment, right? And so still, that logic, when people, because of that baggage, if you cannot present the Climate Justice Charter campaign, I'm making a statement here, as the human rights charter campaign, or you know what I mean, in that way, you're not going to resonate. What's your response to that?
So there's 3 points I'd make. In 2014, Ronnie Casserels, Nazizwe Madladla, Rajlij, and Louise Colvin, Ayanda Kota, myself, we launched a campaign called Vukani Sidikiwe. And basically, we were calling on people in the 2014 election to think about the Marikana massacre and to hold the ANC and particularly the Zuma government accountable. We were calling on the South African people to think about the corruption in Kandla and so on and so on. That was a political hack of the moment, and we went head on with the powers that be. We were declared treasonous by the Zuma cabinet, but we didn't cower. And our campaign became the unofficial opposition in the 2014 national election. We were editorialized, we were capturing the media, bandwagon, etc. But we were making very, very powerful points about where the country is, where the problems lie, and where we need to be going. And that for me is a very, very telling moment about how we can do this, okay? Having moral stature, having credibility, and having very, very serious answers to the crisis we face. The second point I want to make is that we've got to recognize that the ANC is in an indefensible place. It's intellectually bereft and it's at its weakest. I think it's dying. It's terminally ill, basically.
Well, the ANC that we knew is dead. Completely dead. This is a new kind of deformed animal that has emerged, which bears no resemblance to its history.
Exactly. And I actually think if we think carefully about the numbers game in proportional representative institutional politics, it actually is not a bad thing to push the ANC below 50%. Now, in the last election, I think there were about 48 parties that contested and so on. And none of them, in my view, and we've been critiquing a lot of the political parties over the past few years around their commitments to climate and transformation of the country and so on. None of them measure up to what is required in the country, okay? And so I really think that a thoughtful project. Now, we haven't cast ourselves in the mold of Green Party politics or elite environmentalism, as I've said. Our starting point has been water and food, right? And so it's very much in the tradition of environmental justice. And, where you take race, class, gender oppression very, very seriously and you center that, right? That's what we've done also with climate justice. I mean, climate justice is the most transformative paradigm you have. And as I said, we have a plurivision. And the plurivisions address the legacies of apartheid, the current crises, and secure the kind of future we all want. So we are very much a homegrown political force that's alive to the realities of this country, and we want to speak to all those realities. Climate jobs. We can create millions of climate jobs. We can end hunger in this country with food sovereignty and so on. We can ensure clean energy, public transport that can move millions of people every day safely and almost at zero cost, okay? So there's some amazing ideas that can be brought to the fore. So I'm saying that's something we must calculate and think about. The country has an appetite. There's more people outside of political parties in South Africa than inside political parties.
Yes, that's the most important thing.
Increasingly more people are not voting and they are disaffected, and mainly younger people, because they don't have hope. Okay, so I really think we've got to factor that into the political calculation. The last point I'll make is that I think Zaki is very well intentioned, and I think we all respect him. But I must say, I think it's a mistake to think that an individual going to parliament is going to change the power configuration in this country. We need a collective political project, and that's what we are about as the Climate Justice Charter movement. We have an ambition for a majority political project, okay, where everyone owns these crises. I mean, you can go to parliament, you can make noise, you can draw attention to certain things, etc. But in terms of shaping the direction of the country, it's going to come down to numbers, okay? And who has the power to make policy choices for the country, make laws, etc. But the one final point, though, is I think a lot of this push for around individual candidates, and we really need to problematize it, is an anti-majoritarian politics. And what do I mean by that? It's people that have come to a conclusion that ANC dominance is the problem, and therefore we've got to find a way to kind of rig the political system to redistribute.
I'm sure you're not saying that is the position that Zaki would hold.
No, not at all, not at all. But I'm saying that many that have championed this kind of politics are failing to see that if you go down this path, and you institutionalize this kind of representation, I mean, listen, nothing stops individuals from being corrupt. Nothing stops individuals from being bought out and so on. You will,
we've seen that
you will further fragment politics in this country.
But it's happening. What I'm saying, let me push back a bit here. Right?
Yeah.
So what some could say to you after 30 years of party politics, we've got a party political system that is bankrupt, corrupt. We've created a political class. Which political party have you heard in this country in the last 5 years say that the compensation of city councillors is too high, indefensible? Which political party has said that we don't support the remuneration of cabinet members and even the Democratic Alliance? No, they're all waiting. When they get there, they'll get the same, kind of perks. So what I'm saying is, you got a political class organized in political parties who have shown, and I totally agree with you, individuals are, but just as you were saying, can we get a bunch of young and old people together under a platform? It's not dissimilar to...
But it's registering as a party.
Yeah.
So let me say this, Kumi. We've never had a left alternative in South Africa. We haven't.
So why do you think in this election, 8 months from now, less than 8 months from now, a left alternative? Because let me tell you, I'm going to put a controversial position. Listen, I hope, of course, what you try to do succeeds. But here's my...
And we want you there.
My difficulty is, I want to see the pathway. Because right now, I agree with you that the most significant thing that I think people trying to understand, South Africa as well as South Africans listening to this, need to understand, is that the vast majority of people in this country and virtually every country around the world is outside of the political process.
Correct.
Because they're not part of political...
So Kumi, is what we've been saying. We have a crisis not of democracy or constitutional democracy in South Africa. We have a crisis of a particular form of democracy, a market democracy. And that's been an exclusionary form of democracy, right? Second point I want to make is this. Listen, man, you and I know people died, sacrificed, and fought for this democracy. None of us as Democrats can say 30 years later, well, we're just going to rubbish this democracy. We can't. We actually owe it to all those that gave their lives, who sacrificed, who fought this fight to make this democracy work. Okay?
No, and on that we're on the same page.
And that's one of the rationales informing what we're doing. But the other point that I want to make very, very, very strongly is that I think we've got to start thinking, as I said, and I've been saying this consistently, we need a new politics for the new challenges we face. We are talking about walking on a leg from below, so driving the deep just transition, food issues, food sovereignty, water issues, etc., but also having some leverage and presence in the state. There's an appetite in this country, I believe, for democracy to work, for change to happen, and for credible and genuine leadership to come to the fore. Okay, and I really think that potential exists, and that's what we're trying to reach for. And we hope you're going to join us.
I think that's a very positive, and I agree with that. I think people are concerned, they want to participate, they want to make a difference, they are looking at ways in which they can contribute. When they look at the existing options available to them, they are not inspired. I am saying, I guess in concluding our conversation, that of course we need fresh thinking, of course we need fresh energies, but I'm also want to conclude with my assessment that progressive activism in this moment, both in South Africa as well as globally, in even places like the United States and so on, which we took for granted that they would have a certain level of anti-fascism after the Second World War and so on. We need to recognize that right now we are struggling to break through with messaging that actually gets large enough people, because the ideological state apparatus is stacked against us. So given that, even if everything that the Climate Justice Charter campaign is saying is 100% correct, be clear that the forces that are mobilized to tell the people that that's bullshit or that you shouldn't listen is going to be massive, right? Because all the views of those that say this thing would be stated. So right now, I am struggling with this dilemma, personally, because I live in a community that is in decay, right? Garbage is not picked. We haven't had water for 3 weeks now, all of that. And when I look at the state of looting and devastation that the ANC government, in some cases, the ANC EFF government, in the case of Joburg at the moment, and so on, the alliance that they have, has brought us to a point where our society is on the verge of, in fact, right now, there are people calling us a failed state, right? I hate that terminology, but the reality is I live in a community where the state is failing us, no question about it, right? So in this question, given the fragility, is there a space for progressive in the country to make an alliance with more liberal elements of business who won't support the more transformative things that you and I might want in terms of economic justice, but who actually might be looking at this election, looking at where the country is saying, wow, we need a little bit of a kind of strategic alliance to just keep the country together and prevent it from slipping? Because I want to just ask two more questions, right, and give you your final. So remember the question. One is, I'm going to make a statement about an ANC victory or an ANC EFF victory. If that's the new government that we have, my view is certainly if it was the ANC or the ANC and EFF, they will make a determination that this next 5 years, if they win next year, is going to be the last time that the people of South Africa are going to tolerate their looting and their corruption and so on. And if you think we've seen a lot of looting in the last 30 years, I want to suggest you ain't seen nothing yet. So that's the one question I want to respond on, and on my also my commentary earlier. But I do have, okay, answer that quickly, and then I have a very specific question which I want to tell you so you can think about it. So basically, the main reason governance is failing is the rules between people and the governments are completely broken. Actually, maybe they're not broken. Maybe the social contracts that we have in place is exactly as they were designed, to give a majority of society and benefits to those at the top and give crumbs to the rest. So I would like to say, if you had the power tomorrow to draft a clause in every country, a social contract clause, what would the one thing that you would choose, that you would like to see in every constitution of every country around the world as an internationalist? So we'll come to that question last, but give your reaction to what would happen if we had an ANC victory.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it will be catastrophic. I mean, the ANC's record speaks for itself. I mean, it's damning. There's no shift in trajectory. I mean, its policy thinking is locking us further into carbon and offshore oil and gas and coal, etc. You know, the kind of criminality is there. It lives inside the ANC. So I think if the ANC wins, it's going to be more disaster, and possibly the systemic crises I've been talking about will overwhelm the society. Right now, if you look at preparedness index on climate, we like 97, one of the indicators. We're really not ready for what's coming, okay? So that's one likely trajectory and scenario. I mean, the other trajectory and scenario is actually a consolidation of our democracy around extreme right-wing politics. Xenophobia, kind of racism, politics of revenge, you know, politics of revanchist, exclusionary kind of stuff. And it just gets worse like that, you know. And we polarize. And we actually become a country that literally is poised to confront itself through violence. Okay?
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. Given that vulnerability.
So that's another possibility. But that's why I'm also saying to you that because these are kind of possible outcomes of where we are in this conjuncture, we really need to think about a left alternative, a climate justice alternative, a clear tactic that can realign forces. Now, the second point I want to make related to everything you said is that if you look at Joe Biden's administration, and you know, I teach US foreign policy, so I'm constantly looking in that direction. If you read Jake Sullivan's recent speech, the Brookings Institute, he was basically saying that Joe Biden has buried neoliberalism. You listen to Janet Yellen recently about how she wants to reposition global finance institutions and so on. Same thing, okay? Essentially, there's a recognition amongst the core of Biden's political project that the United States needs a new social contract. They're bringing back labor standards front and center, including in their international relationships. They understand inequality makes their country and the world unviable. They understand that. Okay, they understand that you have to renew a social contract. Okay, they understand that financial markets and liberalization and so on is not the panacea. Just growth for growth's sake is not the panacea. It's the quality of these things and so on. So there's a very nuanced conversation going on in the United States and a very profound shift that's going on in the United States, okay, right now. And it's a backlash against this market-centered exclusionary neoliberalism. It's in that context, I think we need to locate the question you're asking about how we relate to capital in South Africa. And essentially, capital, like other countries in the world that have gone down this sort of neoliberalized path, have had everything on the table. For the past almost 3 decades,
Sure.
everything has been sort of swung in their favor, the reforms, the concessions, etc. And yet, capital, interestingly enough, hasn't stepped forward to say, well, we're going to stop unemployment from ballooning the way it is and ensure that the whole generation loses a future. Or capital hasn't stepped in front to say, well, we're going to stop land dispossessions and so on. So capital in this country has a lot to answer for also in terms of where we've come to. But that doesn't mean that they don't have to be part of the
Well,
solution.
we live in a world where
Yeah.
we socialize the losses and we privatize
Correct,
the gains.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. But I think the time has come to have very serious and hard conversations. Because the fact of the matter is that we do need to renew a social contract for this country to address the total crisis. And we are calling it a climate emergency social contract, okay? And it's in that context, we also got to recognize very genuinely and honestly where the problems lie. I mean, if you look at data on carbon emission footprints, actually the rich, like in many parts of the world, are the problem. Okay,
Sure.
so again, hard choices around that. I mean, I don't understand why we don't have a well-calibrated carbon tax that hits big energy users in this country, for example. And it could be balanced with a whole lot of other things in a very smart way. But we haven't done all of that. Okay, we've just continued this thing. So my final point is this, is that talking about this world social contract, okay, that we should have, and the kind of little thing I'd like included in that, I'd like it to state very clearly that the world's rich has the largest resource footprint, the largest pollution footprint, the largest carbon footprint, and that it's time for the rich to give up more than the poor.
I think that's a very, very positive message to end on. And so, Vishwas, why we asked the question about what is your preference, would be your preferred thing, is usually we get something that's quite distinctive.
Yeah.
And I think this is the elephant in the room in many of our conversations globally, and that is everybody is concerned about poverty, nobody is concerned about inequality.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Or they pay lip service to it. And so this has been a fascinating conversation. I hope to have very many with South African activists in the run-up to the elections. And I would like to thank Vishwas Satgar, not for this conversation really, but for his life and for what he has done. He actually grew up in a town called Maritzburg, which I didn't 100% know, which is just about 100 kilometers from Durban, where I come from. I should tell you, the people of Maritzburg, they're very proud people compared to the people in Durban. For example, they have a T-shirt in Pietermaritzburg where it says London, Tokyo, New York, Pietermaritzburg. People in Durban don't have such a T-shirt, I should tell you.
It's a small town complex.
So I want to end with this message, right? Firstly, to say thank you for the work that you and all the folks in the Climate Justice Charter campaign have been doing. It's been a source of inspiration to me and many others. We wish you well in all your efforts. And to the people in South Africa who are listening to this is a scary moment for us. There are real major moral challenges that are being placed before us. What we do in the next 9 months or so before the elections is going to determine not simply what country our children will inherit in the future. But quite seriously, when you add the climate crisis on top of it, is whether they will have any country to inherit at all. On that cheery note, I want to thank our listeners and viewers for joining us for this discussion. Please make sure to follow, subscribe, and do all those nice things that I don't really know how to do. And I hope to see you again next time. Thank you, and good luck with all the work that you are doing to try to make the world a more just, more equitable, and more sustainable place. Thank you.